Entitled at The Big Lie Revisited, How Modern Unions Are Undermining Our Public Services, Our Economies, and Our Societies, and What We Need to Do About It, basically. And I think, looking back over history, over a century ago, when unions first sort of came into being, I think there was definitely a need for them. But now the pendulum has swung way too far in the other direction, to the point that they're harming so much of the economy. In the construction industry is a classic case, when we have things like limited procurement only to certain players, which cranks up the cost of those projects for everyone. We have in Canada, of course, and we're unique in the world, we have forced union dues. Employees that are working in a unionized workplace are forced by law to pay dues, and yet the unions can spend those dues however they want. And we've seen them spent on ridiculous causes like the student riots in Montreal, riots in the G20. We've seen them spent in some Canadian provinces to sway elections in a partisan manner, flotillas to Gaza. I mean, some of it's almost laughable if it weren't, rather sad. And when unions get too much power, and of course in the US and Canada right now, the majority of union members work for government. And we know that as government workers get more and more in terms of salaries, pensions, early retirements with those big fat index pensions, all kinds of other benefits, the rest of us pay for them. And of course you can't have a public sector outstripping the private sector for long before you're Greece or Detroit or many places in California. And even in Canada, New Brunswick, they've had to do some revamps in pension plans and on and on. So, the remarks are really meant to outline the various ways this type of phenomena is causing problems for our economy and our society. Because again, when you see what's happened in, the public sector and many private sector, when people really feel so entitled that they don't really have to work. We know in unions people are promoted on the basis of seniority, not competence necessarily, and so on. And that undermines our productivity. And I see next generations coming up, and they have a pretty profound sense of entitlement for an awful lot of different reasons. And I think one of the reasons is excessive union influence. Certainly in government, that's the case, where we see disgraceful behavior on behalf of a number of government employees, and yet they don't lose their jobs. Nobody would get away with that garbage in the private sector. Ontario is very much a hotspot. We have had a government, and this isn't a partisan issue. People immediately think it's partisan, but it's not. In Ontario right now, we have a hugely union-friendly government, absurdly union-friendly, and more public sector union-friendly as well, although they were very happy to bail out the auto companies, and they're a private sector. But what it has done is we've had our debt doubled in the province. Ontario has become a have-not province in that lovely Canadian context. And of course, we have, representing small businesses as I have for years, they have really harmed the small business community. And you can't do that forever. Small business is half the economy. You can't keep hitting half of the economy and not think you're not going to have problems with your job creation and your wealth creation. So we have some unique things like the College of Trades in Ontario, which is basically very pushed hard by the unions. They would like to turn Ontario into Quebec, where every single person that works on a construction site is forced to be a union member. And of course, Quebec has always been super union friendly, and they're one of the weakest economies in the country. And there's other reasons for that, for sure. They love to duplicate government institutions, for example. But we see the weakest economies seem to be the most that are punitive to the private sector to the benefit of the public sector. And again, you cannot continue on that road forever. And we see the debt implications. We see still an enormous deficit, even though we've had a few years of growth, not great growth. But why haven't we had great growth? Well, we have this weight dragging us down, which is excessive government, excessive employment in government at the cost of the productive private sector. There's lots of solutions. I think one of the main ones is scrutiny, accountability of how unions spend their money. They should only be permitted to force dues when they can prove those dues have been used for collective bargaining purposes. If they want to go off on some left-wing political junkets, which they do with great regularity, then they shouldn't be able to force that portion of the dues. So that's number one. I think with government procurement, there's a very good example. Why should we ever have limited bidding? If you are a tax-paying, legitimate business, you should never be cut out of government procurement opportunities. And of course, we know when we limit the suppliers, we end up with way higher costs foisted on the rest of the taxpayer base. So those are a couple of, I think, really good upfront solutions. The whole area of political contributions as well. We should never have front groups basically paid for by unions, permitted to spend millions and millions of dollars to sway election results in their favor. Again, you end up on that path where you're getting, the public sector notably, and in Canada right now, almost 60% of unionized workers work in government. So we've already got, and that's 20% of the economy. So we're basically handing out the goodies to the 20% at the expense of the 80%. Something I believe should be instituted in any level of government is some kind of independent panel that looks at wages, benefits, retirement ages, pensions, and so on, and says, okay, government, you're out of whack with what that same job would earn in the private sector. We're going to just hold you, we're going to freeze you for a few years, or whatever, whatever it takes. Because there is no reason the same job in government should pay, and in Canada, by the way, it pays in the federal public service over 40% more, at the municipal level about 35%, and at the provincial level about 25% more. Same job, government, private sector, that's ridiculous. They should be roughly the same at best. Some would say government, because they have greater job security and stuff, actually should be paid less, and that was the case decades ago. But I mean, I have to hand it to the unions. They've been amazingly successful at raiding all of us for much, much better perks and so on. And of course, we see in Canada now with an overall unionization rate of 30%. But when we look at the private sector, it's 17%. They're losing. They're committing suicide in the private sector. And their last bastion now is government, which in Canada actually has the highest rate of unionization in our public service in the world at just under 80%. So clearly there's a lot of things. The rules have to be fixed for elections. We have to have more scrutiny on how money is spent and not force the crazy causes. If they want to spend money on that, find it some other way. And things like an equalization between private and public sectors so that we don't all go broke and become ultimately Greece. They have much greater union transparency in the U.S. I have regularly seen reports about what the big union bosses make in salaries and perks and benefits. We see there are, of course, the right to work states, which is one end of the spectrum, which they did in Wisconsin under Scott Walker was very courageous and good on him. He fixed their fiscal problems almost instantaneously by permitting workers to have the choice of whether or not to be a union member. And as we know, many, many, many opted out. And that's another thing, actually. He did something interesting. He actually has a vote annually. Do you still want to be in the union? Why? I look at Canada and I see why, if somebody was unionized 50 years ago, there's no vote to see if the workers maybe want to, reinstate that. That's ridiculous. There should be some rules around, okay, we want to once again have a crack at saying yay or nay to this union that's representing us. It's absurd. No other entity has that kind of, wonderful choice. I think in the U.S. too, naturally they have a lot more spending scrutiny on the way unions can spend money. And, a lot of it is cultural too. We're very entrepreneurial in Canada. I think more so than we really give ourselves credit for. But there is a fundamental suspicion in the U.S. of government, which I like. I think we should be suspicious of government, and we Canadians are way more complacent when it comes to our governments. And although I think I sense myself a bit of a growing unease. Everybody knows the public sector worker who's retired way earlier than them with lavish benefits and pensions at their expense. So I think there is a growing sense among Canadians. But again, culturally, we're definitely different, and that's very good in some respects. But I think we're more too accepting of mediocre government, and I'd like to see us a little more skeptical like the Americans are.